Hi, this is Thomas from Apex Game Tools. In this video, we're going to be looking at the different building blocks of the AI. In a previous video, we looked at the central component called the context, and in this video, we're going to be looking at the rest of the building blocks in the Apex Utility AI. We won't be building an actual functional AI. We will be focusing on the different elements and the different options you have for the different elements. And then in a later video, we will actually be using all of these building blocks to build an actual AI. So, to get started, we need an editor in which to create our AI. We already have one open here, but I'm going to create a new one so that we can start from scratch. Now, you have a number of options when you need to create a new AI. If you already have a window open, you can simply click New and enter a name. You can also move to where the AI is stored. You can right-click, and then you can say Create, and then you can say Apex, and then Utility AI. This will then open a new window and allow you to create the AI this way. And finally, you can just open a new window manually using the menu, which will do pretty much the same thing. You'll just have to click New, and then we will enter a name for our AI. We're just going to call this Intro. Once you do that, it will create a new AI, and it will also create the first selector in that AI. As mentioned in the intro, a selector is one of the building blocks of the AI, which is the outmost building block, which selects between the different options. Let's just have this maximized so we have something to work with. So now we have our first selector. With a selector, on its own, it doesn't do anything. It needs something to choose from. There are a few different types of selectors. As you can see, this one is called highest score wins. This is the default name. You can of course change the name to something that more describes what it actually does. You simply choose the selector, and then you can give it a name, and you can also give it a description. To add additional selectors, you simply right-click on the canvas, and then you choose Add Selector. This will bring up a window where you can select what type of selector you want. And as you can see, we have two options. These are the ones built into Apex Utility AI. You can create your own selectors as well. We'll be getting back to that a little bit later. But as you can see, we have the one we already have in our scene, or in our AI, the highest score wins, and we also have a first score wins. So let's just create one of those as well. So now we have two selectors in the AI. One of the selectors, as you can see, has a title in blue. This means that this is the root selector. This is where the AI will start when it executes. And right now, this one will not be executed at all because it is not connected to the root. Now the next building block is called a qualifier. Qualifiers are the different options that the selector chooses between when it selects which way to go, when it needs to make a decision which will eventually end up with an action. To add a qualifier to a selector, you right-click the selector, and then you choose Add Qualifier. Once again, you are given different options of different types of qualifiers. As you can see, we have 4 built-in qualifiers, but again, you can choose to create your own qualifiers, and they will show up in the list as well. We have something called an all-or-nothing qualifier. We'll just add all of them, and we'll just cover what they each do. There we go. So the simplest one, let's just take that first. just move that up here. The fixed score qualifier simply returns a fixed score. You assign a score to the qualifier, and this is what will be returned to the selector and allows it to choose whether or not this is the proper one to choose. In the highest score wins selector, the qualifier with the highest score will win, not surprisingly. In the first score wins selector, the first qualifier to score above the score of the default qualifier will win. As you can see, when we created the selectors, they all started out with a default qualifier. This is a qualifier that will always be there and that you cannot remove. By default, this qualifier does nothing, so this is simply an idle action. If none of the others are chosen, it means that the selector will do nothing. It will not select an action, and therefore the unit will not perform any actions. The default qualifier can be changed, or rather, what it does can be changed. We'll get back to that in just a second. So, other types of qualifiers. We have an all or nothing qualifier. As you can see, this one has a threshold and it has a number of scorers. Scorers, instead of having a score of its own, it delegates its scoring onto scorers that it has as children. Each of these are then processed by the qualifier in some way. Let's just try and add a few of these. As you can see, we have a number of different scores available. Now, when you do this in your own project, and if you start afresh, there will be no scores available because there are no scores included by default, because all of the scores will be game dependent. So the scores that we see here, they're all related to the survival shooter. The scores shown here are called contextual scores, as you can also see in the title bar. Contextual scores are given the context so that they can make scores based on information available to them through the context. Let's just add a few random scores here to be able to explain what this exact qualifier does. The all or nothing qualifier will score each of its scores, but it will only return a score if all of these scores score above a certain threshold. Obviously, if it is left at 0, it will always score. But if we set this to 10, for instance, then we would have to have all of these, both of these scores score above 10 in order for this qualifier to actually score. So let's say that we set each of these to 10, or let's set them to 11 actually. So if they both score, in this case if they score, these are simple scores, so they just score whatever it says here. So if they both score, they will score 11. This means that our qualifier will see that they each score above the threshold, and it will return a combined score of 22. Now if one of them does not score, let's say it has attack target, does not score, but this one does score, then it will return 0. Because one of them did not score above the threshold, then it will return nothing. Well, it will return 0. So that's how the all or nothing qualifier works. It's all in the name. Next up we have a sum of children. Again, it works on a number of scores, and it does exactly what it says. It sums up each of the scores and returns the total. It has no threshold or anything, it just sums them all up and returns the score. And then we have sum while above threshold. This one is similar, well, to both of these, I guess. It's a combination of the two. It will score all the scores until it reaches one that scores below a given threshold, at which point it will stop summing and it will just return whatever score it reached. So this means it is important which order the scores are defined in. So if I have 3 scores defined, scores 1, 2, and 3, and I have this set to 2. So when this score scores, or rather this qualifier scores, in this case it would actually not score anything, because the first one it would look at would have a score of 1, which would be below the threshold, and it would just stop and return whatever it summed so far, which would be nothing, so it would return 0. Now if I instead move this one up here, then it would actually score 3. Okay. So those are the different qualifiers included, and as mentioned we also have the default qualifier, which is a fixed type qualifier that will always be included on the selectors. The default qualifiers, they do not actually do any scoring or selection, they will just return whatever fixed score that they're given. So obviously if you set this very high, it will, and it scores above some of the other qualifiers, then that is the one being selected. Usually this is left just as at a score of 1, so that it will be the default action if none of the others score anything. But you can set this to whatever you want. Now the third building block of an AI is the action. Each qualifier will have to be associated with an action in order for it to actually do anything. Right now all of these qualifiers, if they are selected, nothing will happen because they have no action associated with them. To associate an action with a qualifier, simply right click it and say add action. And once again, as you can see, we get a whole list of actions, and once again most of these actions are specific to the survival shooter demo. These are created specifically for that, with one exception, which is the composite action, which represents an action that is composed of other actions. Let's try to move or add this one to the first score here. As with all the other elements, you can rename them so that they have a more meaningful name, and you can give them a description. And as mentioned, this particular action, a composite action, has a list of actions that it will execute. So here you can add other actions, and they will be executed in the order that they appear. And you will do the same for all the other qualifiers. We'll get back to the different types of actions that you can add and the differences between them. But there is a third type of action that you cannot directly add, and this is a connect action. As you've probably noticed, we have this small dot on the right hand side of each of the qualifiers at the place where the action is displayed if one is attached, and this is to enable you to connect one selector with another through a qualifier. So if I take this one, I can simply drag it over here, and this means that if this qualifier scores out the highest, it will move on to this selector and have this selector choose which action to execute. And of course you can just continue and connect stuff with each other, as long as you don't do circular connections, which is not allowed. As mentioned, you can also choose an action for the default qualifier. If you don't want it to be idle, you can choose, as with the other qualifiers, to add an action, and you have the same options to choose between. So there you have it. These are the different building blocks. Just one small note on actions. As mentioned, there are different types of actions. There are two. There are simple actions, which just execute whatever they are told to execute or how they are implemented. And then we have something called actions with options, which rely on a number of options to execute their action. For instance, this could be moving. So let's take that as an example. We will also be touching on that. Oops. I already had one there, but let's move this one. So we have attached a move to best position action, and as you can see, this one also has something that it calls scores. Now these are different scores. These are option scores, and they will score options available to the action to select the best one. In this particular case, move to best position, we will be given a list of scores that has to do with positions. All of these scores will score a position, and then they will return the best position to the action, and it will then execute its action on that particular position. Obviously, the scores can score anything, so the options to an action can be whatever is relevant to that action. Yeah, that's pretty much it. We will be looking more into this when we look at specifically implementing the different parts of the Survival Shooter demo. Now, there is one final element to the AI. This is the AI link. As you can see, when we choose that, we will get an option to link to some other AI. If we cannot choose ourselves, but if we choose one of the others, we can then link to that AI, and we do that the same as we link to a selector. Simply connect it to the qualifier, and if this qualifier scores out as the best, it will then delegate the choosing of which action to execute to this other AI. And if you want to see that AI, you can just click this and you will be moved to that AI, and this is actually what will be executed. So those are the different building blocks. The AI window itself also has a few things that we should mention. When you make changes to your AI, you should be sure to save them. We have autosave on by default every 5 minutes. If you want to change that, you go to settings, and you then can change the autosave interval. If you want to disable autosave, you can set it to 0. Just be aware that if you set autosave to 0 and you forget to save and you close down Unity, you will have lost everything you've done. Unfortunately, Unity does not supply anybody with an information when they close down, so we cannot actually save your changes if you just click the X to shut down Unity, or Alt F4 or something like that. So be sure to save your changes, and I would definitely recommend that you have autosave set to an interval of 5 minutes or less so that you don't lose your changes. You also have in the editor, as you can see from the right-click menu, you have different options for copying and pasting stuff, and you also have full undo and redo. Just be aware that undo and redo, they are on different shortcuts than what you're used to. So it is not Control Z and Control Y, it is Control Shift Z and Control Shift Y. Okay. So if I was to do that now, I will just delete the selection, or I will also delete the link, and I can also recreate those. Copy and pasting works as you would expect. You can copy stuff and then you can paste them in. You can also do that across AIs if you want. I can copy this here and I can paste it in here. So there you go. These are the building blocks. In the next video, we're going to be looking a little more into detail on how we actually create a working AI. So see you in the next video.